Okay, once again, welcome everyone. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, and we're very happy to have you all here today for a conversation with Steve Maher and Clara Mattei on Trump, the state, and global capital. Just a quick, brief introductions. Sarah has to leave after about an hour, so we want to get right to it. Clara is the author of The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. She's professor of economics and director of the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa, popularly known as CHE. She previously taught at the New School for Social Research and was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Steve Maher is Associate Professor of Economics at State University of New York at Cortland and co-editor of the Socialist Register. He's the co-author with Scott Aquino of The Fall and Rise of American Finance, and he's also the author of Corporate Capitalism and the Integral State. Stephen,
not that I want to throw back my promotion, Fred, but I'm assistant professor. I haven't yet gotten that far.
I thought I said assistant professor. Well.
No,
okay.
Associate. That's okay.
Okay, wishful thinking perhaps, but it will come.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea here is we're just going to have a kind of an open-ended conversation to begin with Steve and Clara. I have a number of questions that I would like to kind of pose. This grew out of an interview that Steve did with Sasha Lilly at the Against the Grain podcast back in November, shortly after Trump's election. And it gave Steve an opportunity to talk about some of the implications of Trump's second term, what we might foresee. And it occurred to me that it might be good for the MEP to sponsor an event where we could pick up where those conversations left off and kind of see, what has what's new, what's different, what's changed, what remains the same from the discussions that Steve had on that podcast back in November. So before we talk about the Trump regime and the political and economic upheavals that are underway, I wonder if you could help us set the stage by describing the state of U.S. capitalism and global trade and finance since the Great Recession of 2008 and the further shocks that were brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic in the period after 2020. So I'll just pose that to both Steve and Clara, and you can take turns.
Clara, why don't you go first?
No, please, Steve. These are like way off my.
Okay.
Please, you start. I'll just give some small.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that about what's going on with Trump is that, a lot of the time you see this analysis out there that Trump is emerging from the decline or the collapse of American capitalism and whatnot. But in fact, since, the 2008 crisis, the American economy has recovered significantly. And in the years leading up to Trump's election, the American economy was incredibly strong in economic terms. You have The Economist last October ran a cover story which called the American economy the envy of the world. Their American MNCs are making record profits as we speak. The investment has been healthy and strong. R&D spending, management salaries very, very high, of course. So by all accounts, the American economy is doing very well. But I think the big issue coming out of the end of the Biden administration was the spike in inflation after COVID. And that connects to kind of the more significant narrative in terms of understanding the far right in the US, which is that the strength of capital doesn't necessarily translate into the, reasonable standards of living and social conditions for the majority of the population also being rising. So you have a situation in which capital is very, very strong. In fact, as strong as it's ever been, partly as a result of globalization. And yet you have deteriorating social conditions for other sections of the population. In fact, the strength of capital came at the expense of other sections of the population, most importantly, the working class, right, which has experienced significant precarities throughout the entire period that we call neoliberalism. But it was there's an acute acceleration of that precarity and a fall in real wages at the end of the Biden administration, which partly fueled Trump. There's also been a longer term trend since like the 2000 recession, the brief recession at the beginning of 2000, which really accelerated after 2008, of the production of a very, very significant surplus population, to the extent, which is increasingly male too. I mean, more women than men are non-participants in the workforce as a result of the gendered demands of care work and so on, which we're very familiar with. But increasingly, you see a large male surplus population since 2000, and especially since 2008, to the extent that around 30% of the working age male population in the US has now fallen out of the workforce. A significant chunk of that population is what Marx might have called the lumpen proletariat. And this downward mobility, as unionization rates continue to fall, workers' standards of living continue to decline, this surplus population continues to grow, connected with a radicalized section of the petty bourgeoisie, sole proprietors, predominantly around the construction sector, as well as small business that did not necessarily benefit from the recovery that we saw after 2008 in the same way that big capital did. And so this radicalized layer of petty bourgeoisie that had been absolutely crushed by the housing crisis in 2008, as was the working class, found a significant base in this increasingly kind of lumpenized and precarious working class population. And so despite the recovery since 2008, the petty bourgeoisie and small capitalists did not benefit in the same way as big capital did. The COVID-19 crisis further hit those people pretty hard. And despite the recovery, even in the conditions of the working class, especially after 2016, most of those gains were wiped out by the inflation at the end of the Biden administration. And I think the failure of the Democrats to speak to those issues is a huge part of the reason why Trump ended up winning. So we could go into more detail on all of those issues, but I leave it there for now, and we can maybe come back to some of that.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. Thank you so much. I'm mainly here to learn. I just feel like it's so much and it's so complex. In general, I think what I think is common of both my work and Steve's work is, again, to really lay very clearly the contradictions between what is good for capital is not necessarily good for people, right? So this is something that I think needs to be said more and more, and is part of the main trope that keeps us all somehow convinced that this economy is not that bad after all, is because there is some sort of rhetoric, especially coming from the progressive left in economics, that gives you a sense by which ultimately, if only the economy grows, then we can all kind of be secure. And I think this is really an issue, because one really needs to show how actually the logic of profit and the logic of need are really deeply structurally in contradiction. So what ultimately helps the accumulation of capital usually does not at all help the well-being of the population, both in the United States and, of course, more broadly in the rest of the world. And of course, this ultimately is encapsulated, I think, in the most obvious of all most just disturbing metaphors with what is, of course, happening in Palestine right now, because we know that actually this terrifying genocide that has actually accelerated since March 18th, when the ceasefire broke down, right? We know that actually we have hundreds of people being killed every day. They demolished the remaining hospitals in the north of Gaza. The tragedies really never stop. We know that this is actually doing good for the American economy and is stimulating this idea by which ultimately, investing in the military sector and the defense sector is one of the best ways to stimulate the economy, right? So clearly the idea that we have shareholders who are celebrating while a whole population is just destroyed, I think really kind of encapsulates the broader issue with our economic system. And this is something that I think we need to keep keep in mind. And of course, the fact that like Trump has only really accelerated, and this is ultimately what I see, is that Trump has really accelerated the tendencies that are already being put into place by the previous Democratic administration, but ultimately because, again, I think there is some form of structural pattern. Without being deterministic, we do need to realize that there are some structural patterns of these economic forces that shape everyone's lives that are very deeply rooted, right? So how ultimately, I think the big question here is, and it's the question that I'm also trying to think about in my research, is how much social redistribution is actually compatible with capital accumulation. And I think it's actually much less than a lot of lefties want to hope and kind of give us the illusion for. And what ultimately we see is that investing in the defense, and now we see that Trump is going to actually accelerate. Biden had $16 billion in defense spending in 2024, so which was actually, in terms of money, was the biggest in American history. Now Trump is proposing to go up to 1 trillion, so really breaking all records for the Pentagon in terms of support. And again, this is something that needs to be understood as really, really deeply rooted to what is beneficial to capital as we understand it today, and which, of course, does not just include the big corporations and the military-industrial complex, but also all the new technologies in the advanced AI mechanisms and cloud services, right? We know really well that now also Microsoft has workers in Microsoft were criticizing their corporations and were just fired lately. There was that, and again, a form of the fact that workers ultimately understand deeply that what is giving them jobs is ultimately causing deeper forms of social issues and suffering that is felt both, again, in the United States and abroad. Yeah, so these are just some thoughts, is how actually Trump for me is really accelerating and politicizing what was ultimately there. And this is what is interesting, is the politicization, I feel. And actually, I wanted to know what Steve thought, because what we see, I think, is that Trump is laying bare how this economy that, again, is like pits basically need against profit, has nothing spontaneous to it or natural or given. And I think Trump is really expressing this well, right? The fact that he's disrupting very clearly also a lot of what are considered structural norms. So in his acceleration of austerity capitalism that we can talk about, right? The acceleration of the fact that, again, austerity is completely compatible with militarism, because the point is that you're not spending on social resources, but you are spending to ultimately structurally subsidize, de-risk, incentivize private investors. Of course, Steve's book shows very well how this structural de-risking is, of course, what allowed even the concentration of power in the hands of the few asset managers and the big financialization, right? But this ultimately, this is this structural incentivizing, which is like actually the hardcore of austerity, which is all about shifting resources away from people and actually putting all this money in the hands of the few, that Trump is doing so well, right? He's telling us 2 trillion in cuts in social welfare, which is all about cutting food stamps, Medicaid, really a war against the poor. This is like a war against the working poor in a country in which we have over 500,000 of homeless who are workers, okay, in this country. We have, the statistic tells that way more than half of American families cannot really save or make their ends meet. Going back to what Steve was saying about how really this accumulation went hand in hand with the precarization and the impoverishment of American people. Well, in this situation in which Trump is just accelerating this attack on workers, he's doing it in a way that is very explicit. He's not even mentioning the budget issue as like the main reason to do this. He's just saying we just need to dismantle what's there. And in the meantime, of course, he is setting a 4.5 trillion tax break of a regressive type, So that will ultimately benefit the usual suspect in a system that is extremely regressive already fiscally. And of course, he is going to continue investing in the military as one example of where the money goes. So I think, again, we see how Trump is only really making more obvious this conflict between needs and profit that a lot of lefty economists want to kind of hide. Trump is doing it for us. And maybe this is something that ultimately will help with more courageous narratives about what our economy is about, which is, I hope, the only positive thing of this moment is, okay, let's then say out loud what is obviously under the eyes of everyone in such clear terms.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think that's excellent. Excellent. I fully agree. I mean, I think what's the narratives of U.S. decline, that Trump is an outcome of U.S. decline. Ultimately, they serve to hide that what you're talking about, Clara, the difference between the logic of need and the logic of profit. Because what they basically suggest is that if conditions for workers in the majority of the population are getting worse, it must mean that capitalism is collapsing. Because everybody knows, of course, that capitalism doing well means that everybody does well. But that's just not the case, right? Capitalists have been doing incredibly well. The capitalists, just by any economic standards you want to look at, the American economy has been performing exceptionally well since 2008, despite the disruption of COVID-19, which, of course, hits different sections of the population differently and has political ramifications as a result of that, including the radicalization of sections of the petty bourgeoisie. But in terms of the big corporations that are the most powerful institutions, they've been doing exceptionally well. Mm. And so what's actually happening with Trump is exactly what you're saying, that because big corporations, the multinationals, are profiting hand over fist, literally at this moment making record profits despite all the disruption that's happening, they're not willing to enter into a class compromise with the working class. They're not willing to enter into a class compromise with the working class that could re-legitimate accumulation, right? Because Trump is emerging from a legitimation crisis. He's not emerging from an economic crisis. He's emerging from a legitimacy crisis of accumulation. That's the result of the fact that for broad swaths of the population, things are unlivable. The situation is intolerable. And so that has delegitimated accumulation. Now, capital has been unable to enter into any kind of or unwilling to enter into any kind of a social democratic compromise with workers that could re-legitimate accumulation, because that would require a bridging or mitigating or acting against continued globalization, right? The basic liberalization agenda that the U.S. empire has been pursuing since World War II. And so in a context in which you have big corporations unwilling to compromise with workers, doing very, very well in economic terms, unwilling but yet the majority of the population or much of the population experiencing deteriorating living conditions, nevertheless, at the same time, those corporations are unwilling to enter into a class compromise with workers that could redistribute some income, re-legitimate the system. You have a complete impasse of social democratic politics. The far left has been unable to offer a path out of this crisis that's plausible and realistic, right? And so what's left? A nationalist, xenophobic, racist right who has successfully mobilized the contradictions, mobilized the resentments against the globalization agenda that the U.S. state has been pursuing in order to, in a kind of alignment with a nationalist reactionary backlash. So they've mobilized these resentments against globalization. And so Trump emerges precisely from the impasse of social democratic politics in a context in which globalized multinational corporations are not willing to enter into redistributional bargains, class bargains with the working class. In that context, when you have no social democracy on the agenda, no far left path out of this dilemma, you have the right. And this is exactly what happened to some extent in the 1930s, right? Uncomfortable echoes of the 1930s, in which this is not a matter of economic collapse necessarily. It's about the politics of all this and the resentments that are created as part of the unequal way that capitalist growth impacts the population in a very stratified fashion. Big corporations benefit, most people don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wonder if we could drill down a little deeper now into the bloc or the coalition that Trump was able to assemble simply to win the election, which involved tech billionaires, Elon Musk and company, Christian nationalists, Pete Hegseth, a fraction of working people who actually identify with MAGA, Steve Bannon's politics, perhaps. And then many of those who just voted for Trump as what they perceived as a lesser evil, mistakenly, obviously. So how can we assess Trump's social base and its durability on the one hand? And on the other, we need to probably look at the heterogeneous nature of the anti-Trump resistance, which runs all the way from elite law firms, Harvard University, the Democratic National Committee, perhaps even the Federal Reserve at this point, all the way over to Bernie Sanders, AOC, most of the trade unions, defenders of immigrant rights, the Palestine Solidarity Movement. So how do we kind of sort out and parse these different social forces that are in motion or that underpin Trump's regime and that are seeking to erode it and move beyond it?
That's not an easy question. I don't know if Steve, please start. Then I can think of what to say on this.
Okay, all right. So yeah, I mean, I think the kind of constellation that you laid out, Fred, is very much one that is ideological in nature. It's looking at different kind of ideological components that Trump is weaving together to hold together a certain class coalition. And I think what's maybe more revealing is looking at this in terms of the actual class forces that Trump is trying to build a coalition among in order to sustain his, political power. And I think, to start with, obviously, big capital has been very skeptical of Trump. They overwhelmingly supported Harris in the election. The big tech companies were not massively behind Trump during the election. They subsequently donated a lot of money to the inauguration, as did some financial institutions and so on, other sections of big capital. But by and large, the biggest corporations have been skeptical of him, predominantly because of the chaos that he brings. And so, they don't want to disrupt globalization, and yet Trump is running on, attacking globalism and attacking the administrative state and all the rest of it. So I think the most important thing to recognize perhaps about Trump, aside from the fact that he's not emerging from the collapse of American capitalism, is that it shows once again that fascist politics is not something that the ruling class just rips out, a card that the ruling class can just play at will when things get hard, right? Hard right politics emerge through an uncontrollable crisis situation as the least bad option in the context of political dysfunction, in which the state, the normal forms of rule, the normal forms of governance are not functioning properly from the point of view of big capital. And in the case of American capitalism today, you had the extreme intensification of class contradictions inside the Democratic Party with the Bernie Sanders insurgency, which meant the Democratic Party was no longer a reliable manager of capitalism. And then you had Trump, the insurgency in the Republican Party, both emerging from the kind of epoch-making event of the 2008 crisis, which defines our current conjuncture still. So big capital is skeptical. I think that the tech firms were cozying up to him in order to try to get some goodies. Perhaps most importantly, the end of this these antitrust proceedings, which are continuing. And I think they certainly would not be in favor of attacking globalization. I mean, Elon Musk invests huge amounts of money in building Teslas in China. Obviously, we know Apple is completely tied in with globalization. Amazon, no company stands to lose more from tariffs than Amazon does. So big capital, I think, is skeptical. They're willing to try to work with him. But what really, the core of Trump's base, as I was saying earlier, is this radicalized section of the petty bourgeoisie that was devastated by the 2008 crisis and the collapse of the housing market, and a section of small capital, right? Petty bourgeoisie is like small proprietors, owner-operators, et cetera. Small capitalists are like people who actually employ other workers and have small businesses. And I think those two components are the core of the MAGA base. And there's contradictory interests between them, right? Like small capitalists employ other workers, for example. They're very interested in disciplining immigrant workers such that they have no rights, but not deporting them en masse in ways that are going to cause wages to go up, right? They want the attacks on immigrants to be limited to, removing their rights without actually removing them from the country, because they need to employ them and they rely on that cheap labor. The petty bourgeoisie similarly sees them as competition. The parts of the working class that are part of Trump's coalition, on the other hand, may be more amenable to the idea of deportations, right? In the sense that they perceive their downward pressure on their wages as being the result of the large spike in migration that occurred during the Biden years, which had everything, of course, to do with economic growth, sucking in immigrants from Latin America and elsewhere. And so I think the contradictions in Trump's base are very profound. And immigration policy, I think, the mass deportations, militarized deportations that he's apparently pursuing, I think will be a potential force that could break apart parts of the coalition. I think tariffs very much will alienate him from large parts of big capital, certainly from the tech sector that he maybe was optimistically feeling he would be able to relate to. And so I think the Trump coalition is fragile in many ways because it's riven with contradictions. And no matter what Trump does, take Israel too, which Clara was just mentioning. I mean, Trump's base includes both anti-Arab, pro-Israel right-wingers, as well as anti-Semites who are neo-Nazis, right? That alone is a very significant contradiction. He also ran on isolationism, right? Because the impacts of the imperialist wars in the Middle East, beginning with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, those wars primarily hit red states, right? The people who were just thrown up as cannon fodder to go to the Middle East and invade Iraq illegally and Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. These people came from red states. And the cost of those wars and the fact that those people were left behind subsequently with inadequate social services and in many cases not able to find stable employment, Trump's running on isolationism served to shore up those parts of the working class, right, that are living in deindustrialized areas. And yet now we're seeing him getting deeper and deeper into various conflicts in the Middle East. So there are all kinds of contradictions in this base. And I think Trump is a very, very skilled politician. He's able to navigate these contradictions in an impressive way, primarily because it's a politics of affect, right? Trump is expressing rage. He's expressing rage at a status quo that has fundamentally failed huge parts of the American population, that is not able to provide people with the standards of living and the livelihoods that they feel that they deserve or are entitled to, rightfully so. And so Trump articulating this rage at the status quo on the one hand versus a Democratic Party whose primary strategy for opposing this remains holding together the broadest possible coalition of big capitalists, right? And hoping that Trump's own actions will undermine his appeal to the biggest corporation, and then you can swoop in with the support of the entire capitalist class and win the election. I mean, and meanwhile you sit by and do nothing because, of course, the last thing the Democratic Party would want to do, based on that strategy, is make movements toward the working class, because then you alienate sections of big capital. So then the whole strategy is undermined. So they have to just sit back and bide their time and hope that Trump implodes and that they can hold together this coalition of big capitalist firms and then swoop in 2 years or 4 years and win the election. It's really risky, among other things, because there's always the possibility that in the context of the worsening political crisis, some section of big capital will break off from that bloc and move toward the hard right and ultimately see Trump as a more stable and reliable alternative, or not Trump necessarily, but the hard right regime that he might be able to create as a more stable and reliable alternative form of governance to a liberal democratic system that is basically imploding, right? I mean, the dysfunction, the political dysfunction within the liberal democratic state is pretty intense, right? You see Trump actively exacerbating that crisis in the sense of elections are illegitimate, the Democratic Party stole the election, Joe Biden, I mean, I'm sure big capital would rather him not do that. But on the other hand, at the same time as he intensifies this political crisis that he benefits from, he also provides a possible resolution to it, which is a hard right break from normal forms of liberal democratic rule. And in the event that some part of capital can be won over to that program, then we're really going to be talking about a shift toward fascism. I mean, as of now, we're still in liberal democracy. The state, the constitutionalism, et cetera, it's hanging by a thread, but it's there. But there is the possibility of a break with liberal democratic rule, I think, that's currently on the agenda. And that will hinge to a large extent on whether Trump and whoever comes after him can gain support from some section of big capital for a break to the hard right in an exceptional regime, which is a very real possibility.
Clara, I know your work on fascism in the 1930s and Italy and the comparisons you made with the regime of in capitalist regime in Italy with that of ostensibly liberal Britain. were important. Is an important part of your analysis. So I'm just curious to see if you think that how does the Trump program or politics or whatever he's up to, is it, I mean, on the one hand, he's promised working people prosperity, but on the other hand, as you pointed out earlier, he is actually implementing austerity. So is there any comparison we can make with the period that you studied in your book?
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, then I'll start from that. I wanted to start with something else, but I'll start from that. And
do whatever.
But it's good. So historically, the origins of fascism, as the fascism of Benito Mussolini, who kind of gave the name from Il Fascio Littorio. The party was founded in 1921, the Fascist Party, and the fascist regime was strengthened because of the capacity of Mussolini's fascism to actually resolve what it was a deep political crisis, and again, a different political crisis from what we're seeing today. But in a way, I think that's what's interesting, is to see how our economic system is perpetually in some form of crisis. In this case, it was quite of an existential crisis because of the fact that there were the majority of citizens, between workers and peasants, who were basically opposing the pillars of capitalism, wage labor, and private command over investment. Okay, so so Mussolini basically rose to power as the man called by the liberal institutions, right? He was called by the king and by the parliament of that time to resolve the fundamental crisis of legitimacy. So again, I think it was another a crisis of legitimacy for a system that was actually not only had shown its weaknesses, and for this reason was vastly transformed during the First World War, but also real alternatives were being played on the ground, right? So that we had the factory council movement, we had assemblies running collectivized agriculture. There are a lot of things going on, especially in Italy, but also again in Britain and other places, of course. And then we had in the East, we had the Russian Revolution, of course. So in this moment, that's how Mussolini was basically meant to take on the role of crushing organized workers that were pretty strong in that historical moment, right? So then the alliance between liberalism and fascism that we see with Mussolini is, of course, something that we see over and over again in the history of our economic system, is that when it comes to protecting what I call the capital order, just to stress how capital is a political organization, not just a spontaneous economic one, because it's based on the social relation of exploitation. When it comes to preserving exploitation as the kernel to run society, of course, fascism does it better because it does it quicker. It does it by directly having the state intervene and for outlaw strike, torture political opposition, outlaw unions, and so forth. So this is what you see in terms of ultimately fascism being the best student of austerity and the best one to implement austerity. If we understand austerity once more, as I've been trying to articulate in my own research, not as the state stepping back and kind of letting the market be, but the state actually strongly intervening to protect the very foundations for this market that are in fact the social relations of production. So this is what you can see historically. Now, what is happening now? I think what's sad to say is that Trump, and I think this follows well in line with Steve's interpretation. Again, it's very difficult to give simple one-sided kind of analysis of the historical complexity, especially because we're living in it. So it's easier to talk about history because you've seen the evolution and you can study it more. So that's why it's always really difficult. So I mean, take this as you like, but I do think that we can in a way imagine what's happening now as the product of the success of austerity. Because again, if we understand austerity as not a set of policies meant to, stabilize balance the budget or cure inflation, but meant to actually protect exploitation and increase the rate of exploitation, again, by structurally taking away resources from people and protecting the capital holders, then ultimately Trump is the product of a success of austerity, because austerity is exactly meant to disempower people in a way to segment the working class, to make people feel vulnerable, which is exactly Trump's base, right? A base that is ultimately very much now disgusted by the status quo, but ultimately does not see a possibility that stems from power of people organizing autonomously, but instead, of course, hanging on to the strong man and basically pointing the finger against those even weaker. And this is like, of course, it's a pattern. And it's the same pattern you saw with Nazi Germany. If you look at Nazi Germany had been hit by more than a decade of austerity that was basically supposedly, like centrist or liberal or technocratic governments that then escalated into the support for Hitler, who Hitler himself, if you read Wages of Destruction of Adam Tooze, I think it's very clear, did a lot of what I would define as austerity, meaning that he basically kept the working class extremely disciplined, attacked organized labor, while militarizing the economy heavily, and basically, stimulate private capital, which is exactly what Mussolini did. So this is, I think, I don't know, the point is, if we understand Trump as this kind of the outcome of like the political consequences of austerity, which are not like a mistake, but kind of what austerity is meant to do, meaning like maintain a situation of control in an economic system that, again, is deeply, deeply contradictory because of its deep contradiction between what is good for us and what is good for capital, then the question here is, how is Trump going to respond to the demands of this base? How much can this base be so disempowered and ultimately alienated to accept anything from the Trump administration, right? Because we know that people, of course, right now are thinking with the lens that the ruling elite has provided for them. And economics has played a huge role in this, right? We wear the lens, we look at the world through the world of those who benefit from the system. That's why we believe in economic growth as a solution. That's why ultimately we are optimistic about capitalism serving everyone's good. This is just obviously what ideology is all about, like wearing the lens of those who actually are the only ones who are benefiting. Now, clearly the Trump base, even if frustrated, still wears the lens because is not, of course, able to organize politically in opposition to the systematic plunder of a capitalist system, right? So clearly this is what austerity is meant to do, again, is provide a lens that disempowers people so that, again, you see the problem as the immigrant or the lazy or whatever, but you're not looking up. And you're not even realizing what's happening above you. So in these conditions, my question, which is I think really what is I don't know, I'm curious and I have no solution to this, is how much can Trump just continue perpetuating those very policies that have gotten people so upset? Is the tariff like the solution, like to say, oh, now we're imposing tariffs supposedly to make America great again, really going to be sufficient for the base to think that he is doing something for them? Well, of course, dismantling all of those meager social services that are literally having people survive, like food stamps and housing vouchers. Or so is that going to be sufficient, or ultimately this is really a break that is much more profound, that is not going to be resolvable neither with Trump nor with the Democrats trying to recycle themselves? Last thing I want to say is that I think one other issue with the left is that they ultimately usually take for granted how weak the working classes are. And I think this is a problem because, again, if we stop kind of naturalizing our economic system, I think we understand that ultimately, even under Biden had a huge issue. Why didn't Kamala think, one of the reasons why Kamala didn't think it was safe, I think, to invest in working class, like kind of support, is that this working class had like proven to be kind of like a pain in the ass during the Biden period, right? Because people were organizing, people were demanding higher wages, people were ultimately like somehow going against those very foundations of the capitalist economy. Now, maybe not of course, not in the numbers of like very high moments of workers' organization, but contestation is in the air. So, and Palestine made this bigger, right? Again, I think the colonial nature of also the American capitalist economy was very obvious. So these are real forms of attack towards the system that that I think is something that we should consider, because they're not dead. I think they're escalating. So long as people see that the problem is not Trump himself. Of course, the Democrats just want to make it all about Trump and his tariffs or whatever he's doing. But so long as people realize that this is a false solution to a cause that has been perpetuated by this type of management of the economy that is quite common between the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, I think this can create a lot of social conflict that we should take really seriously, instead of dismiss it as, okay, workers are they don't count anything. Well, we do in terms of numbers. The point is, if we can have lenses that are more empowering and organized through them, then I think the Biden years saw that workers can matter, right? And that's partially why ultimately the Fed had to step in so strongly.
I was really struck by what you just said. I just want to repeat it and maybe probe a little deeper. The left tends to take for granted how weak the working classes are, but that the reason that the Democrats have not tried to cultivate greater working class support than they have is precisely because they may be afraid to wake that sleeping giant. Is that the way to put it?
I think so.
Yeah.
I really think so. And again, it goes with how we see the economy. The economy is not an object; it's us. Like, so long as we accept this social conditions, then it's fine. But once people stop accepting these kind of social conditions, then it becomes an issue.
Steve, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, no, I think that what Clara raises is the key question. When are the contradictions in Trump's base going to undermine him, if at all? What are the opportunities to do that? I mean, certainly tariffs are a big one. I mean, going back to 2016, one of the reasons I think Trump was able to come back to power in the recent election was because, going back to 2016, there was very, very low inflation and nominal wage gains, which resulted in significant wage growth for many workers. And I think at the end of the Biden term, there was a spike in inflation coming out of COVID, which people felt very acutely, and they reflected back to the Trump years, and they had better memories of that, perhaps. And I think, so there's some leeway that he has, but I mean, insofar as everything that he's doing right now is causing economic chaos, potentially leading to a recession or stagflation, I think that there's a very real reason to believe that a large parts of his base are not going to accept that. And what then comes next? Well, the Democratic Party is making it very clear that they're not willing to represent any kind of working class alternative. And I think, if you look at the way that big capital responded to Biden, they saw him as superior to Trump. They supported him. They liked him. But by all accounts, they saw Harris as a much superior alternative. And that's because Harris made it very, very clear that she was going to basically undo even the moderate social democratic discourse that Biden was moving towards. The biggest pro-labor president in history, the Inflation Reduction Act, walking the picket line, the NLRB that he had appointed, and even Lena Khan being the Federal Trade Commission chair. I think Harris had been ambiguous even about maintaining her. And so, Harris ran as far away as she could for anything that looks like pro-working class politics. And because of that, she was handsomely rewarded. She was the fastest ever to hit $1 billion raised in any presidential campaign in U.S. history. It took her just 80 days. It was the most profitable fundraising quarter ever when she first announced. They just showered her with money. And she developed her whole economic program openly in close consultation with Wall Street. She literally had conferences with the top Wall Street firms in conference rooms on Wall Street about what her economic policy should be. And then she publicly touted that Goldman Sachs thought she had a great economic program in a context in which you have widespread anti-establishment sentiment, this emerging hard right, absolute failure of the left to offer an alternative that is oriented differently. And of course, predictably, that was a complete catastrophe. And so I think exactly what Clara says is the key issue. At what point does Trump's base get sick of this? And revolt in some way, but that requires there to be an alternative. And of course, the Democratic Party is hell bent on not offering one. So I think in that context, it's hard to predict what happens, right? I mean, people are angry, and insofar as their lives are getting worse, they're going to get angrier. The trade unions, for the most part, I found their engagement with politics during the Biden presidency to be somewhat disappointing. I mean, in terms of what was going to be in the Build Back Better bill, we saw the Biden people really, crushing, marginalizing left proposals that would make that a much better and stronger piece of legislation for the working class. And the unions really didn't play a very good role in that conflict, right? They pretty much supported the centrists in the Democratic Party against the left in the Democratic Party. And that's, that we're not talking about, Vladimir Lenin reincarnated here. We're talking about Bernie Sanders and AOC and people who are proposing, moderate social democratic programs. And the trade unions didn't play a particularly good role in that. So I think there's a deep political project here that's needed, that's both creating an alternative to the Democrats and also pushing the unions. Like, they have to be transformed. They're not fundamentally oriented towards class struggle right now. They're oriented in a very narrow centrist, kind of political direction, which ultimately is part of the issue, I think, over the long run. So I completely agree with what Clara is saying. And the critical thing for the Democratic Party is that, and has been, to provide capital with a responsible manager of capitalism, right? The Republican Party has had this role of recuperating sections of the population that are maybe alienated from the globalization consensus by swinging to the hard right, right? You see this beginning with Goldwater, but all the way through Reagan, certainly Bush, Trump, and bringing into the coalition, the ruling coalition, these fractions, these class fractions that are maybe alienated from the liberalization consensus. But that depends on the Democratic Party serving as the responsible manager of capitalism to be the alternative to that. And the Democratic Party has been absolutely hell-bent on doing that. And I think the approach of Harris and her strategy vis-a-vis big capital has been very much about, just as Clara says, not allowing anything like Sanders to ever happen again, because that was very dysfunctional from the point of view of their ability to maintain an alliance with multinational corporations.
Yeah, and if I can just last thing I wanted to add, I think yes, the fact that even, I mean, I do, going back to the question, how much social redistribution is compatible with capital accumulation? Ultimately, social redistribution hurts because it politicizes people. People get stronger, right? That's the opposite of austerity. People get stronger when they do have the resources to organize, to actually survive. I mean, what COVID showed was exactly that. Even in this bad situation, in which people were clearly made more precarious by the COVID conditions, still the fact that they got some sort of support, very meager support, while the state, of course, were funneling all the money in the financial institutions and the corporate sector. Still, this little money was enough for people to like feel strong and say, "Fuck off! I'm not going to go back to work." I mean, 30% of the workforce quit in 2022. Some went back to other jobs, better jobs, other didn't. This is a symptom of how workers are strong, even if they're not unionized and even if they're not like organized in a very like institutional way, right? And this is scary. This is terrifying for the elite. So this is what I think is important to keep in mind, and that can give us some hope, is that the system is ultimately fragile politically. It is based on a constant effort to support it and maintain it in operation when we know it's operating on the shoulders of people. That it's not a system that, and people know this, and I think this is really important because unions, of course, they get co-opted. Of course, it then becomes part of the governance of the economic system that ultimately is interested in pursuing the status quo of the establishment. But it's enough to see what's happening here in Tulsa for me. It's really interesting because for how much I was saying how I'm like I'm losing it because it's too much to like. I just opened this new center, the Che. The responsiveness of people is incredible. And none of these people are unionized or like participate in any official party, but they do organize on the ground. They have their own means of like wanting to break, right? So the point is this anti-establishment sentiment, when it is empowered, can really do something that is strong and is terrifying for the elite. of all natures, and I think that's where we have to push right now is get more people involved in conversations that are courageous and actions on the ground, because I think there's the anti, but there's also the constructive part, and people are really, really thirsty about the constructive part that is not the usual vote Democrat or join a union that will do this the interest of like your very small sector. And I think the tariffs are showing this, like they're just like the way the unions are just like really buying into the system is, I think people are that they don't understand. Like it's clear that it's such a like a narrow view that is not really offering anything in a moment in which the problems are so huge, right? How can you have such a narrow view when the problems are so profound and people just like feel it all the time? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And what do the Sanders and AOC fight oligarchy events show, right? I mean, tens of thousands of people coming out in red districts, these Republican town halls. I mean, I just saw one, I think it might have been in Oklahoma. 800 people showed up, and the Republican the representative didn't even show up at the event. People were pissed, right? And so there is this real deep desire for some kind of political alternative that goes beyond the return to the Democratic Party neoliberalism, right? People really do feel that, and they really do want it. The problem at this moment, I think, is that there's just a lack of a political vehicle for that energy to consolidate around. And so you have, Bernie Sanders and AOC, they're drawing these huge crowds, but where is that going to actually lead? That's the question that I'm always coming back to, Is it going to just be, get AOC to be the vice president for Pete Buttigieg and then try to get as many left people as possible to vote for President Buttigieg? Or, maybe AOC will be the nominee for the Democratic Party. That would be, even a better alternative, obviously. But if it just ends up with, more, try to build up a left, energy on the left to then channel it into voting for Democrats, we need something more than that. And so there's a question for
and I mean, AOC, you've seen the best of the best. AOC, what did she do about Palestine? Absolutely zero. Like when it comes actually to going against the system, the solution is to conform. So I
exactly.
Really, and it's not even her the issue. Again, it can't be about the problem of like individual subjects. The problem is like the type of system they operate in, and like our political system is meant to avoid any forms of kind of representation of the real radical alternatives. And so, yes, definitely, I think the whole party politics needs to be somehow like, I don't know, overcome. But how is the real question?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
No, I have been struck in looking at some of the Bernie AOC rallies that they have put on the platform before they speak. People from local unions, people from local community organizations, and so on. And at least in one of the rallies, AOC led off her talk by talking about Mahmoud Khalil and the threat of deportation. So at least to that extent, she was upholding the Palestine solidarity movement, at least implicitly. For what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the position of Sanders and AOC on Palestine has not been great overall. They have not. Every time Sanders speaks about it, he always has to preface it with, Israel has the right to defend itself, and I mean, the idea that there's anything defensive whatsoever going on right now on the part of the Israeli military is just beyond absurd. It's a systematic attack on a civilian population to the broadest extent possible. But also, I think that it just shows that, and I think what Clara is saying as well, I agree with, is that we need some kind of a political vehicle. And there's a real crisis of the left. Like, despite the fact that there's all this energy and all this desire for something more, the left is in crisis. And the crisis of the left is a component of the situation that we're in. It's a very important component of the situation that we're in, because it's the failure of the left to be able to offer a realistic, plausible path forward that is ultimately critical for enabling the rise of the hard right. If we had something to offer that was a universalistic path out of the social crisis people are living with, that was plausible and serious and that people could join and participate in, I think there's an opening for that. But the left hasn't been able to pull that together. We don't have a political vehicle. And so Bernie and AOC become what's there and what seems real and what seems tangible. So they have these rallies and they have 35,000 people show up, which is amazing, right? There's this energy bubbling up to the surface in these moments, but again, I think I'm very skeptical of where that's going to end up over the long term. And I think there is a dire need for us to seriously start thinking about what's step one for laying the groundwork towards something else. How do we break out of this impasse of the two-party system that are completely captured by the political institutions of the capitalist state in a way that prevents them from offering the real substantial working class alternative that we need so desperately, and which is the only way to ultimately deal with the hard right. Right? You cannot deal with the hard right with more corporate neoliberalism. It's not going to work. Right? We've already seen where that goes, even when it works. Right? Which is that working class people are harmed, their lives get worse, and they ultimately end up in this legitimacy crisis that fuels the hard right. So we need something else. We need a way of building the power of the working class politically and creating some kind of vehicle, I don't know what that looks like, that allows for that politics to be expressed and to become real in the real world, to actually create some kind of change to improve people's lives. That's a realistic path forward.
Yeah, yeah, and I think yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, Clara.
No, yeah, I think we were gonna say the same thing. So Fred, go ahead, and then I'll say something.
Well, I have a slightly different angle, but it's is the left suffering from the fact that it has become too easy using social media to turn out thousands of people in the streets or at a rally without the kind of patient organizing and organization building that it required in the past?
So, 2 points. I think here, maybe it's not just a crisis of the left, but the crisis of the left is an expression of a more profound problem, which is the fact that the institutions the left has been operating in ultimately for the whole entire history of capitalism, for me, are structurally limited, right? So the institutions we have at our disposal, the union, the party, are ultimately built hierarchically in a way that ensures this structural separation between this bubbling energy of the base and those who represent, right? And ultimately, I think the revolutionary intuitions of if you read Rosa Luxemburg even or Antonio Gramsci is all about the fact that it's not just about the groups that make up the left that are failing. And I think I think deepening the issue that Steve is mentioning. I just think they're kind of saying, well, they're failing because the institutions they've been operating within are already bourgeois institutions that are meant to create exactly kind of a compromise with the forces of the capitalist system. So how do we rethink our institutional foundation in something that is truly democratic and horizontal? And that has been ultimately, I think, the real challenge that the revolutionary left has always faced, is like, what are the institutions that can bring about a real break with an alternative, right? And ultimately, I think the council structures and the conception of planning all comes from that. Now the issue is that it's really not easy. So that what I would say is that I'm reading now about, in my very little time, about the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. It was shitty as the way they were able to pass Medicaid. They passed incredible reform that are still the only things that stand in this country, that, by the way, Trump is gonna just slash with his saw. How do you say it in English?
Chainsaw.
Exactly, that Milei gave Musk. So, but the point is that if you look at the dynamics of how these reforms were passed in the 60s, the institutional infrastructure was really unfavorable to these forms of social redistribution, right? And there was huge limits to them, by the way. It was a constant compromise. But that's the thing, we tend to idealize, you say, is the left too soft? I would say even if you go back, in the moments we idealize 60s and 70s as moments of great left power, the institutional framework was always kind of chopping, the leg before it could even really, run and kind of thing, right? So it's really there. And actually reading about the 60s and 70s, it's incredible to see the limits of the political infrastructure that, again, is the one that is most compatible with capital accumulation, right? That's the whole point. The state is meant to cater the interest of capital, and the state is organized in a way that really limits the potentials of any form of energy. And this was already the case when we kind of think of the moment of the high ground of reforms in this country. So I think now it's really about like really trying to figure out what new institutions can be built in order to channel this energy. As Steve was saying, like I don't think we are the ones like on our desk to say this. I would say that the only thing that makes me kind of want to like survive in Tulsa rather than like try to run back to New York City after a year here in Tulsa is the fact that you feel like, okay, it's on the ground that you experiment this kind of stuff. It's actually like now we have this thing about like trying to build this worker center. Worker centers by definition are anti-establishment in the very way in which they say, hey, unions are not sufficient in terms of like getting people together and fighting more serious battles. It's small things, but they do exist in the United States. There's even a handbook about worker center, like what can a worker center become in terms of channeling political power. It's stuff that one has to just try out, I think, like start and try, and like it's not going to happen through, I think, reading books. One can learn from the past, and there's a lot of really interesting experiments, mostly not in the West, by the way. But I guess the point is, right now, I think it is the moment to try out different institutional, kind of experiments.
This might be a good opportunity to open the conversation to the rest of our participants here today. If you would like to ask a question or make some comments, you can either type the word stack in the chat and we will add you to the speaker stack, or you can use the React raise hand function in the bottom of your screen for Zoom. And perhaps there's a small enough group that we can just, you can just speak up. And if you start talking over each other, I'll call you to order, as it were. So does anyone like to join the conversation here? Questions or comments?
Well, I can definitely just agree, Clara, with what you were just saying about the kinds of institutions that we have to think about building in the context of the disarticulation of the working class as a political agent, right? That's been a critical part of the success of capital over the neoliberal period, has been the decomposition of the working class as a historical force. And so part of building a political alternative has to revolve around forming the working class as a subjectivity, as a political and historical force. And I think, party politics at this point is not the answer at all. We have to build a base for something, and nor are the unions, with to transform the unions. And so I think the kinds of organizations you're talking about are right in line with what I would think are necessary.
Let me call on David.
Hi, this is a question for both of you, I guess, but in particular, Steve pointed out the fact that the far left hasn't been able to offer a plausible alternative to the political crisis that we have, and I think that's right, but what is plausible about the far right alternative? If we talk about socialism, we say, well, we don't seem to have a road to socialism, a path to socialism, clear in our minds, in the way that people, even into the 1960s, thought they did have. But what is plausible about the alternative of Christian nationalism or of any kind of xenophobic nationalism at this time? It seems clear that this offers nothing in terms of the working class, in terms of a better life? Do people really? It seems like there's a lot of the appeal of Trump is just pure hatred and anger, which I understand the hatred and anger, without people even necessarily believing that it's going to make anything better for anyone. So I'm just curious. I mean, maybe it's a question of psychology, but I'm just curious about what you think about that and why, and also how would, before one goes about building a movement, one does need to sort of think about what is a plausible alternative. From the left, I mean. Anyway, that's my.
Steve and Clara, do you want to take several questions at once, or do you want to take them one at a time?
Yeah, we can take several.
Okay, let's do the next three, and then we'll see where we're at. Jason, David, and Nina. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of going off of what David was saying there. I mean, I feel like I saw a lot of, leading up to the election, I saw a lot of pundits on the left, academics, talking about how Steve, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, about all of the official numbers for the economy seem great, right? Unemployment and the stock market, all this stuff, but the people's lived experiences is they're not doing well, and so it felt like people just voted for Trump because the last 4 years were not tenable for them. So they're going to throw the Hail Mary and vote for Trump, even though they, who knows, right? Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. I guess the question is, like, what do we do about that? Because I hear people again on the left say, no, the economy is great. People just don't understand it. They don't understand that the economy is great. They're buying into the big lie from the right wing that the economy is terrible, but clearly we know that people's lived experiences are not good. So anyways, just wanted to throw that out there.
I have a short question about media and communication, especially around like the idea of setting up worker centers and the kind of work that can be done at worker centers, and the kinds of experiments that might be possible. What does working class media look like? I feel like we don't have a working class media, working class communication at a more granular level as well. What can that look like, and what can we do to sort of experiment with new forms? Most of my students who come in to class with working class critiques that they've picked up from media get it from TikTok and the social media they interact with, which sometimes can be very good and sometimes can be awful and whatever. And I feel like the working class, the real left perspectives that exist out there that undergraduate students have access to mostly come from whether or not they can train their algorithms to find the good voices in their social media feeds. And outside of that, there isn't really a place that feels like they can go, which is like the place you go to for these perspectives and that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering if you're familiar with experiments and or if you have any thinking around media and communication in general. And thank you so much for all of this.
Okay, Nina.
Hi, my husband Ernie has a comment.
Yes, I agree with David's comments about the media. We have a serious problem with the media. Mark Twain once said that if you don't read a newspaper, then you're uninformed. If you do read a newspaper, then you're misinformed, and that it seems to apply to all of our corporate media in this country, newspapers, radio, TV, all of it. I don't see that we're going to go anywhere for ordinary working people until we have real democracy in this country, where people actually have a real choice at the ballot box.
Yeah.
So I think ranked choice voting is something that we have to focus on a lot, so that real ranked choice voting. A lot, some of the things that have been proposed have been pretty crappy, but Maine has, I think they have a fairly good system. But we need ranked choice voting, and one of the choices might want to be, as Ralph Nader proposed, none of the above. So, and if none of the above were to be the choice of the majority of the people, then all of the candidates that were being proposed would not be permitted to serve, and we'd have to come up with a new election and new candidates. I don't see that we're going to have a democracy as long as we have billionaires that can buy the government. You know, we have maybe half a dozen families in this country that own half of the wealth of the country, and you know, the rest of us basically are left with the remaining 50% of the net worth in this country. So we have to do something about the wealth inequality. Our tax system is terribly unfair. At the end of World War II, the top income tax rate was 94%. The top corporations, most corporations were paying 70%. And it seems like almost every president from, you know, after World War II has managed to lower taxes for the wealthy and place the burden, more of the burden on working people. That has to end. So we have to do something about campaign finance reform. And you know, the Supreme Court made it really hard for us with Citizens United. There's been some proposals. Bernie had a proposal, and Andrew Yang had the proposal of democracy dollars, where we give everybody some money for national elections, state and local elections, so everybody can contribute to the process, and that, you know, the candidates that accept this clean money, the democracy dollars, I guess was what they called it, wouldn't be eligible to take large contributions or from PACs. We also need media money. If people could have money to spend provided by the government for local media, you know, state media, national media, you know, foreign media, all of these different categories of media, then maybe we get the truth once in a while. But we don't really have democracy in this country. We have, you have fascist A or fascist B. You know, take your choice. That's what we have. That's what I have to say.
Can I?
Okay, thanks, folks. Clara, go ahead, and then we'll
Yeah, I
go
want to actually add a question for Steve, because I have to intervene in a debate on tariffs, and I have my thoughts, but I would like to know. I mean, I thought this question was going to come up immediately, so I was waiting. If you can give us like your brief take on tariffs as well as one of the questions in this round, that would be great. Also because I maxed 10 minutes and I do have to go. I will be very brief. I think all your comments were great, and I mean, I don't know if I have cogent answers to much of that. Yes, definitely we don't live in a democracy, but as in a way, like I also tried to show historically, again, like the tension between democracy and capitalism is at its core, is it part of its core nature. And actually what you see is that the effort has been historically to de-democratize the economy more and more. So actually, if you look at the evolution of economic institutions through time, and like especially the institutions that manage the economy, the macro level, right? So the fiscal and monetary policies, it has always been about really avoiding participation from people, even from political parties, right? That's the independent central bank. That's what it's meant to do. The treasury as a very kind of like technocratic institution, what it's meant to do. So ultimately, that's like part of the parallelism I draw in my own book between liberalism and fascism in the 1920s, is exactly to show, hey, you know, fascists do it their way, liberals do it their own other way, but the ultimate result is the de-democratization of the economy, which is at the foundation of why we don't live in a democracy, right? Because if you take away from people the decisions on their basic material conditions, then what is left? So it's not only just that we, like, of course, our society is based on exploitation, that by definition means that people give up their agency in deciding what is being produced and for what reason and in what way, you know, and what's the purpose of production supposed to be in the first place. Of course, there's that level, but there's also the level of really trying to avoid people from participating once more, because technocrats know very well that if people do participate, they screw up capitalism. That once people do participate, they will vote for need and not for profit, and this will be at the foundation of why the system will not be able to maintain itself. And so that is, again, part of the thing that I keep saying is like, it's an effort to democratize an economy. It's not spontaneous. It's done actively through state intervention, through legislation. So this is what has been happening. And I think that's why we can then feel that, okay, this has been happening, then there must be a way to strike back that is ultimately strong just by the fact that people are more and realize that this is happening on their own skin. So that's just my 2 cents. About the social media, what are the sources for the left? Exactly. I mean, the idea of the Che, I mean, I can tell you my own little experience, the idea of the Che is in fact to provide, I know there are many channels, but we hope to provide one that can offer some knowledge that is more profound about the economy. So we do have a YouTube channel, Che Tulsa, U-Tulsa. You can find it easily, Center for Heterodox Economics, U-Tulsa. And we are trying to see if we can actually have a podcast now running, and hopefully, you know, it takes more time, but like also a form of journal or something. So I agree. And that's where like the center for me is going to hopefully do something, is that I've been at the New School as associate professor for 8 years. And I've seen like in a place like the New School that it supposedly is, you know, the hub of heterodox and radical and Marxian ideas, these people in this, my colleagues, they didn't really open themselves up too much to the real world of people, right? And I think this is a problem that a lot of lefty institutions have, is the way in which even academics tend to be very removed from actually intervening. You know, someone like Rick Wolf intervenes, and I think he provides an important service. Again, there could be more of voices like him, or even like, you know, critical, slightly critical of what he says and like contributing further. But people like Rick Wolf are actually considered by other academics absurdly not professional enough and not, you know, serious and scientific enough. You see the problem of how academics are like deeply complicit in this, because the reason why there isn't like actually like resources around is because ultimately we speak to each other. And then of course there's amazing books around, like Steve's book is incredible, but it's circulating amongst a group of people that is not able to really to like cut and like get to people. That's why I think we need channels. That's why I hope to have do at the Chase, to like, you know, without dumbing anything down, making knowledge accessible and empowering. So you're welcome, of course, to like follow us. Hopefully we'll do something. We are at the very beginning, but there definitely needs more of this, and especially also connection with those who already are doing a lot of this. Okay, I'm gonna shut up, pass it to Steve, and listen to his answers, and then I'll go. And I thank everyone. I thank Fred. It was really lovely to be here with you, and I hope you can have a constructive last half hour with Steve as protagonist. Thank you.
Clara, thank you so much for joining us, and I wish all the success in the world to Che, the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll just start with Clara's question on the tariffs. Scott Aquano and I actually have a piece that just came out in the New Left Review on Trump's tariffs, which I think covers a lot of what I would say. Basically, I mean, since World War II, the American empire has been organized around this idea of, you know, free capital mobility, well, increasing global integration, and after 1970, global capital, free mobility of investment after the Bretton Woods period. And I think what that was always sold in nationalist terms. It was always sold in, this is going to be good for America. And that meant that the costs that inevitably came with this took the form of a nationalist backlash. And there's been a right that's been persistently present since the 1970s, at least, that has articulated its opposition to global liberalization in precisely the terms of, you know, America first, basically. And I think what Trump is aiming to do is to basically undo the globalization era. He's trying to unwind that form of American empire that is organized around goods trades deficits and services trade surpluses. Right, the United States is uniquely able to run trade deficits because of its role as the global empire, the global reserve currency the global issuer of the reserve currency, and so it is able to uniquely run trade deficits. But Trump has been obsessed with the trade deficit, and I think he wants an alternative world order in which the United States is a kind of export-led industrial power. And I think, and certainly also one in which finance is a lot weaker, and national manufacturing champions are the kind of hegemonic fractions of capital. I think that's basically impossible to do. I think it's extremely unlikely it will be successful. I mean, you can see this from the way the tariffs were calculated. They literally took the goods trade deficit, divided it by the imports, and divided that by 2, right? I mean, so it's literally the reciprocal tariffs are just specifically aimed at reversing the trade deficit. And I think onshoring as much production as they can, it's not going to work. It's extremely unlikely to succeed. The undoing globalization requires a lot more wide-ranging policy than just tariffs. It's going to require an industrial policy, a very robust industrial policy. It's going to require a range of capital controls, all sorts of things that Trump is not even remotely considering doing. Ultimately, it would come down to a huge conflict with the capitalist class, right? And Trump is not willing to have that fight with capital. And so ultimately, you'll see Trump putting the tariffs in place, but then making deals, right? Making exceptions for Apple and Amazon and Google to be able to continue to manufacture their electronics in sweatshops in China. Trying to allow U.S. allies certain exceptions for this or that, and it's the odds that this is not a sustainable path forward. Capitalism can't run like this, and so I think given that Trump has neither the will nor the capacity to take on capital in the way that would be necessary to really break with globalization, I don't see it happening. But that is his objective. I think more than likely it's going to be a catastrophe. And I think like Sean Fain, is calling this a victory for workers is also a disaster, because the most likely outcome of that will be to discredit any serious left attempt to break with globalization going forward. Because this is not going to work well for working people, and even if it does result in some onshoring of auto from at the expense of destroying the Canadian economy and hurting the Mexican economy, it's not going to help the rest of the working class. And so ultimately, the kind of broad-based class forces that we need to build, of the kind that you were talking about a second ago, Clara, it's going to disrupt that project, not advance it. So I think it's a mistake for the working class and its representatives to suggest that these tariffs are good for workers. And I think what Trump is aiming to do will almost certainly not work, and it's more than likely going to be a catastrophe. As for the other questions, I think, David, your question about the far right program being more plausible. No, it's not. It's not more plausible. The only difference is that it was tangible, right? It was on the agenda. Trump was running for president. You could go vote for him, and if you were pissed off at the status quo, you had a way of expressing that anger, which was to vote for the guy that was saying the status quo is terrible, it needs to be overturned. But I think that the disaster of Trump's economic policy, for example, including the tariffs that I was just referring to, is one that reflects the limits of what Trump can actually accomplish. I mean, there's an impasse of social democratic politics and the limits of the capitalist system in its current form to undertake significant redistribution, just as Clara was saying. That applies to the left in terms of social democratic politics that might emerge around Sanders or whatever. It also applies to the right. Right? Capital is no more willing to compromise with labor around the program of so-called national conservatism pushed by ghouls like Josh Hawley, right? This idea that some far-right corporatist bargain between American workers, quote unquote, as the Teamsters president O'Brien referred to it, and capital on the other hand, that's not any more viable than a social democratic compromise on the left. Corporations are not any more willing to engage in redistribution just because you call it, national conservatism than they are to compromise on the basis of progressive social democracy. So all of these programs are ultimately unviable. The idea that you're going to get a redistribution in a significant way through the Republican Party is no more plausible than on the left, and it's going to be a disaster. And if Bernie Sanders had won, in 2016 or 2020 and had become the president, he would be facing the same contradictions. And I think this points to some of the limits that some of the questions were referring to around, voting systems and the like as a significant project the left should take up. I mean, it doesn't really matter how Trump or Sanders or whomever gets into power, right? The limits of your ability to maneuver it within a capitalist state that remains tied to a global economic order anchored by American multinationals and the free movement of investment globally, it's still going to be there. And that political institutions are still going to be disciplined by the basic structural necessities of capital accumulation. And so, yes, some of those reforms might be good in terms of providing working class political representatives and forces more room to maneuver and perhaps to build and cultivate the kinds of forces at the base that will ultimately be necessary to break with globalization and break with neoliberal capitalism and austerity, precisely the kinds of things that Clara was mentioning earlier. Ultimately, those are going to face the same limits. I mean, if Bernie Sanders were president and there was a financial crisis like there was in 2008, what's he going to do? Of course he's going to bail out the banks. Of course he's going to bail out the financial system, because otherwise the economic system is going to melt down, right? If Bernie Sanders is president and, redistribution that he's proposing is causing a profit squeeze or some kind of profitability problems for capital, of course those programs are going to be rolled back. And you've seen this again and again and again with social democratic parties and forces throughout the entire 20th century, right? They run up against the structural limits of capital. This happened in the 70s, precisely as Clara was talking about, and on a bigger scale in Europe than the US, right? They run up against the structural limits of capitalism's ability to support these class distributional bargains. There's a profitability problem, and what happens? Those social democratic parties become the most aggressive and vehement forces in favor of pushing back, rolling back those very reforms that they were supposedly in favor of previously. And you see this certainly in Canada with the NDP and the Bob Rae government in the 1990s, but on a much bigger scale in France, in England, in Germany, right, over and over again. So social democratic parties, when faced with a crisis of capitalism, reflecting the limited ability of the capitalist system to support these distributional bargains, they have a choice, right? At that moment, there's a political option. You can either mobilize the working class to push beyond capital accumulation towards some kind of alternative grounded in public control of investment, right? And a democratized economy responsive to social needs rather than private profit on the one hand, or you can support reducing real wages, rolling back taxes and spending, hoping to restore capital accumulation that can then apparently in the future, so hopefully restart the upward escalator of working class living standards and so on that social democrats imagine capital can kind of endlessly support. And I just don't think that that's realistic. And the problem is that when these social democratic parties get to that point, there's not even a choice anymore, because the structure, the organizational form of those parties is top down. It's already based on not mobilizing the working class beyond what the technocratic elites who run those parties are willing to support, right? And so there's already been a hollowing out, a lack of capacity to mobilize working class forces in a radical mass-based way that would be necessary to push through a capitalist crisis towards some kind of alternative system. In other words, the limits of social democracy are not circumstantial. They're not contingent. They're baked into the organizational structure of those parties and the political strategies that they embody from the very, very beginning. And so there's a need for a fundamentally different kind of organization that is based on the mass mobilization and engagement and democratization, building of the democratic capacities of the working class, such that when a crisis of capitalism is reached in terms of its ability to support these kinds of reforms, there's an opportunity to push through that crisis towards something else. And that's exactly why, for example, Trump not having any orientation toward doing that is precisely why he can't win with the tariffs. He's not going to win in a fight with capital because he has no social forces to do so. Ultimately, he's going to have to accept the disciplines of capital. And we're going to see that happen as the tariffs are gradually rolled back, exceptions are made, deals are made, or there's going to be some kind of a big crisis. But ultimately, I think this is really what it comes down to is the need for deep organizing, to build the social capacities and the political capacities to push beyond capitalism. So yeah, I guess I can it's pretty much, I can leave it there. I think that's.
Okay, thanks. We have about 20 minutes left. I have one more question that I'll just bring up in the spirit of the Marxist Education Project. I was just wondering how we could generalize and reflect on the value and applicability of Marxist theories of state and class to understand the present moment and formulate prognoses for the future of capitalism, both in the United States and as a global system. So basically, give us the kind of the Marxist theoretical framework that we need for understanding this. I mean, that's what the spirit of all of your remarks, both of you throughout today, has been in that framework, but I'm just maybe make that more explicit and refer us to some some key texts, perhaps, and thinkers that help us do this.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that really the experience of Trump reinforces over and over and over again the importance of the Marxist state theory that was developed initially in the 1970s by Nikos Poulantzas and Ralph Miliband. I think Poulantzas' book on fascism and dictatorship is incredibly important for understanding what's going on with Trump. The basic insight is in many ways encapsulated with this concept of relative autonomy, right? The capitalist state is not simply the instrument of the dominant corporations. It's not simply, controlled directly by, the leading sections of capital. The capitalist state actually has to operate at somewhat of a distance from the leading sections of capital, right? It has to be relatively autonomous. It has to articulate a broad, what Poulantzas called an unstable equilibrium of compromise between different fractions of the capitalist class and other social forces that can support the hegemony of the capitalist class. And that's because individual capitalists are primarily concerned with their own bottom lines. They are not particularly concerned with building broad class-wide power. They are concerned with making profits in their own firms and for their own investments. And so what that means is that there's a need for a political institution. The capitalist class can't rule directly, right? It can't rule directly because each individual capitalist doesn't have a class-wide perspective. They might not even believe that they're part of a thing called a class, right? They might just think that they're an individual competing in a marketplace or whatnot. So there's a need then for a political institution called the state to balance the competing interests of different capitalists, different fractions of the capitalist class, different sectors, different firms, and to organize a structure of class hegemony based on cultivating the support of subordinate parts of the society, subordinate classes, to support the rule of the capitalist class. So what that means then also is that not only is the far right not necessarily simply a card that the ruling class can play at will when things get hard, it actually means that politics can kind of get out of control of the ruling class, right? Like the state has a degree of autonomy such that the the ruling classes can't directly control what it does and how it does it. So that creates significant amount of room for there to be dysfunction in the systems of rule through which capital normally, quote unquote, governs. And that includes, in our case, the United States, obviously, liberal democracy. And what's happened with the rise of Trump was effectively, as I was suggesting earlier, this radicalized petty bourgeoisie coming out of the 2008 crisis, finding a base in an expanding strata of a surplus population from the point of view of capital accumulation, or expanding lumpenproletariat. Regardless of whether we're in a recession or whether we're in a period of economic recovery, since 2000, and especially since 2008, the proportion of the population that makes up this reserve army has been growing, and especially it's becoming more male. And so you see the radicalized petty bourgeoisie finding an easy base, finding a ready base, especially after the dislocation of the 2008 crisis, in a section of the working class where, manufacturing employment was already basically a straight line down after 2001 when China was admitted to the WTO. After 2008, manufacturing employment declines even more rapidly. So you have the incredible acceleration of the precaritization of working class existence. You have the radicalization of the petty bourgeoisie and sections of small capital. They organize this MAGA movement, which ultimately takes over the Republican Party, and despite the fact that the Republican Party remains structurally linked to big capital and the capitalist state, it increasingly becomes pulled in the direction of this radicalized petty bourgeois-led insurgency, and that creates dysfunction from the point of view of capital, right? It makes things very difficult, especially when the other party that makes up this two-party system, the Democratic Party, is also experiencing an insurgency from the left in the form of the Bernie Sanders movement. And so from the point of view of capital, liberal democracy here is not offering an option through which it can rule in the normal way, right? There's a political crisis. And in that kind of a situation, what big capital does to resolve that crisis can take different forms. One of which is to back the creation of an exceptional regime, a fascist regime. There are other opportunities, there are other possibilities as well. But the only way we can understand Trump and why Trump emerges is if we see the state not as the direct instrument of capital, because capital would not have chosen Trump, right? And just like if Clara was here, I wish she could participate in this part of the discussion, because in the 1930s, certainly in Germany, capital was not Nazi Hitler and Nazism as its top choice. Nazism was the least bad option among a series of bad options amidst an uncontrollable crisis situation. And that's exactly, there's some strong parallels with what's happening now, right? That there is a crisis of the state, a political crisis, not an economic crisis, right? The economy is doing very, very well, actually. So there's a political crisis of the state. It's delegitimated, and capital's options are Kamala Harris, which they love, or Donald Trump. And insofar as Kamala Harris is unable to win, and the political crisis continues to deepen, one way of resolving that legitimacy crisis is to back the hard right alternative, right, and foreclose the democratic space that the liberal democratic state affords. Now, that's not happening right now. So far, we're seeing most of big capital almost entirely continuing to back the Democrats. That doesn't mean that they'll win, right? The state being relatively autonomous means that there's the opportunity for other class forces and so on, political projects to gain political power within the state without the imprimatur of big capital. And that may happen. That may continue to happen. Or in 4 years, the Democrats may squeak by with a Kamala Harris type candidate with a pro globalization, pro neoliberal politics. But the point is that the whole phenomena of Trumpism and the far right in the United States, the only way you can understand it is if you see the state as relatively autonomous. Because if capital had its way, it wouldn't be choosing this disaster. It would be choosing Kamala Harris doing more neoliberalism, continuing the policies that have been in place since the 1990s that they've been profiting handsomely from. And Trump is a problem for them. I mean, they think that maybe they can co-opt him and they can work with him. They want to butter him up. You saw after he was elected, they were pouring money into his inauguration, hoping that they could win favor with him after having opposed him. But there's no necessary reason why he has to do that, right? And he's not doing that. He's continuing to do things that big capital finds incredibly disruptive. He is causing a severe crisis of the dollar system that's ongoing as we speak, as treasury yields are climbing and the dollar is falling. This is a historic crisis of the dollar that had not occurred since 1945 with the Bretton Woods system. So all of these things are an incredible problem, and they're worsening the political crisis in a way that opens us up to the possibility of a far right regime that could be more favorable to a section of big capital that might break off from the liberal consensus. That would be the big threat.
It's hard to say how.
Oh, I think we just lost Fred. David, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, since we seem to have lost Fred.
Am I back? Hello?
Oh, no, here he is. Here he is. You're back.
I hit a little internet hiccup here. Just Steve, it seems to me it would be the capitalist class would be hard put to move toward a hard right regime under Donald Trump, because they already don't trust him. They see how irrational and out of control from their standpoint he already is. So they probably wouldn't be interested in putting more eggs in that basket right now. But on the other hand, what other alternatives do they have? There's not.
Well, that's just it. That's just it. I mean, that's how they saw Hitler too. The capitalist class in Germany wasn't itching to have Nazism in power. They really were not. They thought Hitler was an insane person. They thought the world was laughing at them. And I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler, and I'm not saying that this is right on the horizon. I think you're right. I think by and large, capital is very skeptical of him. But I also think that given the general level of disorder, and we don't know, we still have 3.5+ years to go here. What kind of crisis can emerge, right? Especially amidst the fallout from the tariffs in this current moment, right? Some dire economic crisis. Also, we have a worsening climate crisis, right? We are all but certain to sail past 2 degrees Celsius of warming, and which will inevitably result in serious social crisis, including things like food shortages, right? Global famine. Like there's all kinds of a disaster on the horizon in terms of the ecological dimensions of this, which could lend themselves very easily to some kind of authoritarian exceptional regime. Certainly, it's hard to imagine like normal liberal democratic 2-party rotation in power persisting in the context of the very, very dire ecological consequences that we're going to be facing in the event that something is not done very soon to avert that. And so whether it's Trump or the successor to Trump, the overall institutional and political health of liberal democracy isn't looking very good. And so I think Trump is ultimately only a hint at what's happening now, a hint at what is in store for us in the event that we don't find a progressive left-wing alternative path out of the current crisis that we're in, socially and ecologically.
David, is your hand up again there?
I'd give someone else an opportunity.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
Okay, just quickly, it seems to me that when I mean, you say the U.S. the big capitalists do not support Donald Trump, but Elon Musk is the most richest man in the world. I mean, you can't say he's a small capitalist. He may be an outlier, but I see over the decades there's a whole and not an inconsiderable section of the U.S. capitalist class, and of course we're being very U.S. centric here. So I mean, there is a whole other world out there. That has pretty consistently supported, the systematic dismantling of the social safety net that first developed in the 30s and was extended in the 60s. That has systematically been willing to support hatred and exclusion of, basically the reintroduction of discrimination against. They've hated what they call DEI, what we call DEI. They've hated it. It's not just it's Musk. People like the Waltons, people like what's his name, the Home Depot guy, Sam Zell. Some very, very big and powerful people. So, it's not like there's just a few like whack jobs like Steve Bannon out there. I mean, it's amazing. Those people are really powerful because they're really, really rich, and they basically engineered the takeover of the Republican Party. And by the way, apparently, as far from what I can tell, Elon Musk does believe that the capitalist class could rule entirely by itself, with no need for any kind of intermediary constitutional system. He's said a number of things that seem to indicate that, him and his that little crowd around Peter Thiel. So there's that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see how that goes for Elon Musk in the event that happens. I mean, it's impossible to imagine. I mean, there's no way that a capitalist could directly manage the kind of trade-offs and compromises to manage to create the hegemonic order that is required of a broad base of the capitalist class. I mean, Elon Musk has his own particular interests. He's in this because he wants to rip off the state and get contracts and that every other, in order for there to be no state needed to govern, every other part of the capitalist class would have to just be okay with that. And apparently their interests don't matter. I mean, that's not going to be functional politically. You need to be able to organize a broad base of political legitimacy from among capital. And so Musk is an outlier in the sense that he is so wealthy and has been able to achieve this certain position of political power within the state. But that may yet result in some kind of political crisis in the sense that other parts of capital clearly are not happy with this. Your point about the Waltons and the Home Depot guy is well taken, but I mean, these are outliers. The majority of the big corporations we're in favor of the Democrats. That's reflected in fundraising. That's reflected in the broad base of support that Harris received for her candidacy from the political establishment. I mean, they overwhelmingly wanted her, and they were not willing to. They certainly would prefer to avoid the kind of disruptive politics that Trumpism represents. Most importantly, the attacks on globalization. Yeah. And even if they didn't take him seriously, I mean, there's all these articles now coming out in the business press where Wall Street people are saying, we didn't know he was going to go that far, and of course they didn't. Well, they wouldn't have. But no. But I think, I think there is a, if you look at Trump's donors, overwhelmingly the big corporations donated to Harris. There was a small number, a handful of extremely wealthy ultra billionaires who donated very large amounts of money to Trump. Most importantly, Elon Musk, who donated like what $250 million or something like that, and then a handful of others. And then you have a lot of self-financing, a lot of small fundraising, a lot of et cetera. That not huge donations from the biggest major corporations that you see in the case of Harris, who flooded her with $1 billion within one quarter. So I think there is this very reactionary fraction of big and medium capital. I think steel is obviously a medium kind of capital. Their relationship to globalization has been mixed. Other than that, you see like the Koch brothers, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, Elon Musk. I mean, you can literally name them as individuals. You couldn't do that in the case of Harris, right? She in terms of the broad base of capital support that she has, there's no comparison. But I think that certainly Andreessen and Musk believe that they can entice other parts of capital onto Team Trump. I think that's become more complicated since the tariffs, because I think Elon Musk, even himself, has been publicly very, very critical of them. And, I don't know what constitutes a break finally with Trump. Clearly, he's still working with him and doing the Doge stuff. But I think their hopes, at least in the short term, that they're going to get some significant part of financial or industrial capital, I mean, is remote. I mean, there are sections of finance that were more open to Trump. Steven Schwartzman, the guy who's in charge of Blackstone, the private equity company. There are these individuals, especially in the private equity world in terms of finance, who are more open to Trump. But by and large, these guys want stability. They want low inflation. They want liberalization. They want the dollar as the reserve currency, and they want the working class discipline. And the Democratic Party is doing that. I mean, and unless Sanders or somebody like him ultimately is able to win the nomination and potentially disrupt things. So I think, from my perspective, I think the big issue that we're facing is big capital, the political forces that it is lined up behind in a way that is unprecedented in terms of its just monolithic support for the Democratic Party right now, aren't able to achieve any popular base. And so in that context, you're in a very unstable situation. Like, representative liberal democracy cannot persist without a base, without some kind of popular legitimacy, lest some kind of severe political disorder emerge, which is kind of what we're seeing. And so in the event that capital no longer feels it can maintain order and stability politically by ruling through the two-party system and rotation in power, that's when you start running into problems. There's a show, Babylon Berlin, that I really like, which, it's not perfect, but it's interesting. It kind of depicts in a relatively saccharine, film noir kind of way, the interwar period in Germany and the rise of Nazism. And there's a great scene where this guy who's like the chairman of the board or the president of the big steel company is sitting in his boardroom. The Weimar Republic is kind of collapsing. It's weakened. I wouldn't say collapsing. And he's sitting in this boardroom full of other capitalists, and they're all proclaiming how they're good Democrats. They don't want anything to do with fascism, these barbarians, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, he poses the question to the boardroom. He says, we're all betting men. We're all capitalists. Which side are you going to bet on is going to be able to win this political conflict? And that is the key question. At what point does capital decide that it's a safer bet to go with a far-right regime than to continue to believe and bet on the idea that liberal democracy can stabilize the political situation and create the kinds of stability that are necessary for capitalism to function? We're not there yet, but I think that is the key question. And I think people like Musk, people like Andreessen, they're betting that liberal democracy isn't going to last very long. And I think this is merging with the kind of prepper culture in Silicon Valley, where people are apocalyptic in their worldviews. This has been reported on now for many years. There's this whole culture in Silicon Valley of people who are basically waiting for the apocalypse. And I think those people are under no illusions of what kinds of strains society is going to fall under as the climate crisis intensifies. So this is coming. And I think we have to figure out how we're going to deal with it. And I think just hoping that the Democrats can continue to squeak by is not going to be enough. We're going to need to organize an alternative, and it's going to have to involve challenging capital.
Well, on that note, which I won't say is optimistic, but is realistic and is very helpful. The whole conversation has been so helpful in understanding what the heck is going on in the world today and around the Trump regime. So I hope everyone will continue to join us for Marxist Education Project classes and events. I want to thank Steve Maher, and I already thanked Clara. But thanks, Steve, especially for joining us and discussing this. And I hope probably in 6 months or so we'll come back and have another conversation once things have proceeded. Hopefully not too much further downhill. But
I was going to say, if we're still around.
Remains to be seen.
Maybe we'll be underground, by that point.
Yeah, we will be in some fashion. Okay, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And keep an eye on www.marxedproject.org for all of our activities and events. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Nice to see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.